Thank you for joining us today for our first Othot Talks Higher Ed. My name is Carly Rolls, and I'm the Manager of Content Marketing at Othot. I'm very excited to introduce our Othot Talks Higher Ed series. Throughout the year, we will be interviewing higher ed thought leaders and experts. We hope you learn something new or take away a best practice or gain a new perspective on an issue or challenge. Thank you for listening. I'd like to introduce Fred Weiss, President and CEO of Othot.
Thanks, Carly, and thanks everybody for joining us today for Othot Talks Higher Ed. This is our first of several interviews with thought leaders in higher education. As Carly mentioned, I'm Fred Weiss, and I've been in the higher ed technology space my entire career. I spent about 20 years with what is now Ellucian. I'm the former CEO of iModule Software, and I'm now thrilled to be the CEO of Othot. I wanted to put together a series of interviews because I know I've always learned something by expanding the folks to whom I listen. I'm one of those individuals who sign up for lots of industry webinars. I may not listen to them all live, but I do listen to them all. When we started planning for this interview, COVID-19 was just starting to impact campuses. And now campuses are closed. Millions of students have returned home and classes are being delivered online. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Lots of change very quickly. Today, we're going to talk about technology and higher education broadly and in the context of the current environment with COVID-19. Our first guest on the Higher Ed Talks Live is Casey Green. And Casey, welcome. Glad to have you with us.
Fred, thank you. My thanks to you and to Othot for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Yeah, super. Those of you who are listening may know Casey from the Campus Computing Project or from his popular blog, Digital Tweed. He's the founding director of the Campus Computing Project, which is the largest continuing study of e-learning and IT planning and policy issues in American higher education. Launched in 1990, campus computing is widely cited by campus officials, corporates as a definitive source for data, information, and insight about key e-learning and IT issues affecting colleges and universities. Casey also recently served as the director of the Digital Fellows Project, sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and he moderated To a Degree, which is the foundation's post-secondary success podcast. Casey's the author, co-author, and editor of more than 20 books and published research reports, more than 100 articles in academic and professional publications. His Digital Tweed blog, which I mentioned earlier, is published by Inside Higher Ed. Casey received the first EDUCAUSE Award for Leadership in Public Policy and Practice, which cited his prominence in the arena of national and international technology agendas and the linking of higher education to those agendas. And in February 2019, EdTech Digest listed Casey among the 100 top influencers in EdTech, stating that he is a definitive source for the higher education transformation conversation. And as everybody can see, we're conducting today's interview from our respective home offices. With me on the East Coast and Casey on the West Coast, we are most definitely practicing physical distancing. So thanks again, Casey, for joining us and for writing such a wonderful introduction.
Fred, thank you. Actually, that was my mom's work. I'm honored that you would tag me as a thought leader. I'm very leery of that term because, you know, for all the folks who are self-declared thought leaders on LinkedIn, if you have to proclaim yourself a thought leader, you're probably not. So I take, you know, some satisfaction that you're doing it as opposed to me.
All right, well, super. I certainly consider you one, Casey. Over the course of the years that we've known you, that's always been the case.
That's very kind, thank you.
So while we're recording in the midst of COVID-19, we think that the topics that you see here are really important ones to explore with you today, Casey, both in the current context and in the historical context. We're going to start our conversation around overall trends in higher ed tech, then work our way through the use of data and analytics, being sure that we're touching on the human element of those things as well. And then we'll move on to advanced analytics, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and we'll end with more reflections relative to where we are in the midst of the C-19 epidemic. Sounds like a plan?
Sounds like a plan, thank you.
So let's get rolling. So as I mentioned, Casey conducts an annual campus computing survey, which is released in the fall of each year. Talk to us a bit, Casey, about the general themes and trends that were uncovered in last fall's survey relative to higher education technology.
Thanks, Fred. You know, there really is a point of demarcation in terms of the conversation about issues. between before March 1st and after March 1st because of the the coronavirus issues. Had we been having this conversation in January or February, and you would ask me, what are the issues that emerge, not just in the fall 2019 survey, but sort of the surveys coming into that. There are a couple that are sort of top of mind. We saw from CAOs a real concern about the engagement and the level of knowledge on the part of chief academic officers. About a third or more were concerned that they felt that their CAOs were not well informed or well engaged. We've been seeing issues about hiring, that campuses are a competitive disadvantage in terms of hiring and retaining IT talent because of the competition for talent off campus, given where the economy was, again, pre-March 1st. I've been on a tear for the last several years talking about innovation and infrastructure, and particularly instructional infrastructure, in terms of user support, instructional support for faculty and user support for faculty and students. Again, we see that. And while in theory, before March 1st, we were almost 10 years past the Great Recession, we still see campuses across all sectors, and particularly public institutions, reeling from budget cuts, both annual budget cuts as well as mid-year budget recessions, and those have compounding consequences with no let-up in demand for IT resources and services. And finally, one that I know that both close to my experience and close to your concerns is the issue of analytics. That I see in our data, when I talk with CAOs, when I talk with CIOs, we do these surveys, what I've characterized as analytic angst, a huge investment in analytics on the part of campuses across all segments and sectors, and a real concern that we're not getting bang for the buck. We're not harvesting the benefits of those investments in terms of campus policy, programs, and planning. And we can take that apart as we go forward. Obviously, as we sort of go into the post-March 1st, the whole issue with the movement, what I would characterize in the wake of COVID, to stream and screen as campuses, cutting off classes and closing campuses, this kind of mad rush in an incredibly short period of time, whether it was 2 days or 2 weeks, as faculty being informed, go to screen, creates incredible pressures and challenges for all folks in the academic enterprise in terms of increased challenges for faculty, who may not have these skills as part of their portfolio. It highlights the absence of instructional support, which we've not done a good job with anyhow. Challenges for students. I've not seen data for higher ed, but I'm thinking about an article in the LA Times this week about K-12 in Los Angeles, which is the second largest school district, where huge numbers of students are not logging in, either because they don't have access to the right kinds of tools or resources, or maybe it's out of apathy, other kinds of issues. I've been talking about the issue of as we move to digital content as opposed to digital access from my other surveys of faculty in the last several years. We know there's a big concern on the part of faculties and CAOs, academic officers, that many students don't have the right tools and platforms in the movement to going all digital. That's only highlighted. And I think, honestly, we should credit COVID with creating a new point on the instructional continuum. We've talked about on campus and hybrid and then going online. We now have this point in between of teaching, essentially remote teaching. And no one should confuse that with a well-designed, well-planned online course. I think it was concerning and yet candid on the part of Randy Weingarten, the head of AFT, the largest teachers union in the country, earlier this week, talking at least about what's going on in K-12, saying that no one should confuse what we're doing with remote teaching as being the same quality. And that has huge consequences, not just in K-12 and higher ed. But again, we can come back to that. We're going to probably have to come back to that in this conversation.
Yeah, and the other thing that strikes me, I think those are all great points. So to play off a couple of things. One is there's also the issue, it seems to me, of the digital divide in terms of who has access to high-speed internet in order to take advantage of this online or better termed remote teaching environment. I know I've spoken to some of our clients. We even have some staff that now being forced to work out of their home actually don't have high-speed internet at home. And one of our staff members at Othot is a faculty member at a university in Pittsburgh, and he too has said that he's got a number of kids in his class who don't actually have high-speed internet access at their home. So there's that issue of digital divide as well, and I'm sure you're hearing about that too.
It's both the access to Wi-Fi. You can't go to Starbucks or any place else, But the other part is just platforms. Yes, probably most students, the vast majority from the data I've seen, have smartphones, but a smartphone is not an adequate platform to do classwork. I mean, again, I think we're seeing more of this in K-12 than higher ed, and the rush to buy um, small notebooks for $200. And campus is trying to get platforms to their students. But this is kind of trying to put digital fingers in lots of holes in a dike, and it's a huge problem playing catch up in terms of how do we get Chromebooks to students? How do we pay for them? As sort of the tech, for the moment, the remedy du jour, if we can get platforms to students, and then how do we get access? Again, I'm hearing of lots of districts that are taking school buses and driving them to neighborhoods to light up for K-12. Harder to do for higher ed. And for those students who lived in campus adjacent housing or who lived in campus housing who are now home, many of them don't have Wi-Fi access to do the work that's being expected of them.
Yep.
It's going to be a lost term.
Yeah, and then there is the other bit that you mentioned about what you've been seeing in the survey about budgets, and obviously in the wake of COVID-19 too, we know that there's a lot of concerns, especially amongst public institutions, but across all institutions, about what's going to happen to institutional budgets, and of course, IT budgets are a big part of institutional budgets.
Yeah, my concern is even before the COVID crisis, as campuses looked at some of demographic crisis in terms of looking forward, current problem challenges now going forward into the current decade compared to the one we experienced 40 years ago, the so-called, the great enrollment crisis of the 1980s, is there's going to be a tendency to cut. And that's going to be absolutely the wrong move, because that's going to be a downward spiral. Word will go out quickly. If you have whacked, if you have reduced, if you've imploded the instructional infrastructure at your campus, that's going to get out very quickly, and that's going to create problems in terms of that enrollment pipeline. We don't know what September is going to be like anywhere at this point. Certain campuses are safe and protected on the basis of reputation and resources. Many are not, up and down and across segments and sectors. And what that's going to mean for students, what that's going to mean for faculty, what that's going to mean for instructional personnel and the instructional infrastructure going forward.
Well, we could talk about this slide forever. Let's move on. I know we're also going to come back to that conversation about chief academic officers in a little bit. But let's move on to the next topic that we had on our list, which is about the investment related to data and analytics. Casey, you and I have known each other for years, but it was actually your most recent blog post that reconnected us. That article, if you remember, appeared in late February in an Inside Higher Ed article, and it was entitled, as you can see on the screen, Still Not Using Data to Inform Policy and Decisions. What prompted you to write this?
So there were a couple of things in terms of, again, looking at what I've characterized as analytic angst. I ran the Inside Higher Ed surveys of CAOs in the first iterations in 2011 and 2012. And in both the President's survey in 2011 and the CAO survey, we saw that a large number, a third of presidents and provosts were saying, we're not doing a good job of using data for planning and decision making. And then at the end of January, Inside Higher Ed released their CAO survey, and that number increased from 20% to almost 30%, a little higher. I mean, there's a huge jump on the part of CAOs in a moment of private candor saying, we're not doing this. And yet we know over those years, Fred, that institutions have made a huge investment in analytics, and some have done it incredibly well. I mean, if you look at the story, and one of the best stories, of course, is Georgia State, where an investment in analytics has had tremendous impact in terms of retention and graduation rates, not just in aggregate, but in terms of separate student populations. But it wasn't just the analytics, it was the morning after strategy. It wasn't just that the analytics would kick out an email to say, Casey, you're going down a rabbit hole. We're monitoring what you're doing on the basis of your interaction with the LMS and other stuff. But they had a strategy and they had an infrastructure and resources for those students. That made a huge difference to eliminate those retention and graduation gaps. Some other institutions as well have done a tremendous job. But again, the data we see from these independent surveys, what I hear from CAOs in my own survey, we're still not doing a good job in terms of what we hear from CAOs and from CIOs about harnessing and leveraging the power of analytics for planning programs and policy. We're not doing the morning after strategy in terms of harnessing those resources, pulling those resources together to say, okay, this is where we go. This is how we help our students and faculty.
Well, and I'm struck by the fact that I've been looking at the survey for years, the campus computing survey for years. I'd swear that CIOs have ranked a greater investment in analytics and business intelligence in their top 5 priorities.
It's been one of the top issues, and then when you combine that, you sort of aggregate with student success, and there's no question that analytics are a key part of the student success initiatives, in terms of mapping, targeting, whatever it might be. And then to find, as we see in my surveys and the Inside Higher Ed CIO survey, that's still a large proportion are saying we're not doing a good job of using our investments, using data, using our investments in analytics to help guide, to help develop, to do planning programs and policy. It's distressing at minimum. And it's a major issue with, obviously across most segments and sectors.
Well, some of our listeners might know that I post regularly on higher ed topics to both LinkedIn and Twitter. And I reposted that article and commented on it, the one that we were just talking about, what actually led to this interview. So in the article toward the end, and you've kind of implied this a little bit even in this conversation, that what's needed is a real balance for human intervention and high tech in higher ed. So that balance between human intervention and high tech. And I think you've used the term tech-enabled high touch.
Absolutely. This is a matter of the sum is more than the parts. Let's go back to Al Gore and the great internet conversation of 20 years ago. And we had these tensions between high tech and high touch. And actually it goes back even 20 years earlier with megatrends and John Nabrett talking about the interaction and the reaction of high tech versus high touch. But at least my scan of the landscape over the past 3 decades, the best implementations of technology are tech-enabled high touch. Certainly that's what's happened at Georgia State. We look at analytics and some of their other efforts. We look at Arizona State University, which appropriately has gotten a lot of acclaim for its efforts in terms of its online programs. It's not just that they have great content on screen, but they built a supporting infrastructure for their students. Same thing at Southern New Hampshire, same thing at a number of other campuses. It's not that one supplants it supplements the other. There's a gestalt in this process. And if we don't do that planning, that process to kind of leverage the power of both, then we're not going to get the benefits of either. And I think one of the additional challenges that we confront in this COVID environment with this rush to screen and screen is that how do we do the touch part of that for students? Can we do it with Zoom sessions? Potentially, but now we're signing sort of the dark side of Zoom at many campuses is the Zoom bombing and those interruptions when the screens that are creating a lot of chaos and discomfort. That will work its way out. It will take time in terms of Zoom addressing some of those issues and users getting smart about how to handle some of those issues. But again, there's not one technology that's the panacea, that's the silver bullet for this thing. And we've got this time pressure to do it fast. We've got this time pressure to do it now. We're going to have huge questions about quality, obviously. We should not in any way think that what's going on now, whether it's freshman gateway courses or trying to teach organic chemistry, the last part of the term, online like this, the loss of lab courses, or anything else is going to be comparable to what it might have been before March 1st or March 16th in terms of what's going forward over the next several weeks. And how do we recover that? For the students who are trying to graduate, for the students who are in gateway courses for their foundations, and all points in between, and for the faculty who find themselves overwhelmed and are being told, you got to do this, or where's my instructional support to help me do this? That's not part of my tech portfolio.
Well, and speaking of, the current environment, I mean, certainly in an environment where, on the recruiting and admission side, just thinking about where we are in the calendar, institutions being worried about a decline in international acceptances or enrollments, institutions being really worried about what does that do to net tuition revenue, institutions worried about the loss of in-person events for admissions programs, and all of those impact on what yield is going to look like and what the shape and formation of their classes are going to be. It strikes me that Technology can help with that, but only when there's the human overlay to help people better understand what are the potential impacts and thinking about how do we use tech to point us in a particular direction, but just use our knowledge of our own institution, the cultural aspects of our own institution, the student experience at our own institution, and combine that with technology as something that enables decision making.
No question. And on the instructional side, I've often said we need to make technology safe for faculty. The fact that they can feel comfortable and confident. Does this stuff work? Does it bring a benefit to my students? And I'm not talking about just posting a syllabus online, but some of the other things that are coming to us in terms of classrooms, resources, and services. And that safety issue has just been elevated. Zoom was the solution, but now Zoom brings its own problems. Again, I'm confident that that's going to get worked out in a week or 10 days for most of us. But again, for the campuses that are using Zoom as an alternative to those kind of meet and greet sessions towards close, for the campuses that are using Zoom with large undergraduate survey, gateway courses, or for graduate seminars and all points in between, there's still a huge great unknown that we confront.
Yep. Well, I guess I'll use this opportunity to put in a shameless plug for Othot. I think, as you know, Casey, what we do is provide a technology solution that optimizes the relationship between institutions and their constituents. And we do that by providing this prescriptive analytics platform that delivers understandable AI at the individual level that helps our partner institution accelerate growth and improve student success and drive alumni engagement. And we know that our partners, to your point, that are most successful are the ones that combine our prescriptions with that human interaction. And case studies about that, whether that's at, for example, Texas Tech University or the New Jersey Institute of Technology, you can learn more about those on the Othot website. But it reemphasizes your point, Casey, about it's got to be tech-enabled, high-touch. How do we bring these things together to best serve our students and best serve our institutions?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to change gears a little bit. It continues a conversation about analytics and raise something that I think gets under my skin a little bit. So every once in a while, as you all know, EDUCAUSE creates and publishes these Horizon reports. And most recently, maybe about 2 or 3 weeks ago, EDUCAUSE published their Horizon report for teaching and learning. And they had a chapter in that report about artificial intelligence and machine learning. But they essentially defined these as chatbots. Now, that's a very narrow definition around AI and machine learning on campuses, and it pretty much leaves aside the further aspects of both predictive and prescriptive analytics. What's your thinking about how we can get campus leaders to think about AI outside of what I'd call the chatbot box?
Well, I think one of the reasons to focus on chat boxes, Fred, is because that's what most of us are familiar with from the consumer experience. We log into a website, and Amazon is one example, and boom, that window comes up that says, how can I help you? In one sense, it's kind of a tier 1 service support, tier 1 response. And there's some value to that. I used to tell a story as I was thinking about Amazon's website compared to campus websites. If you think about Amazon, you buy something, I buy something, there's a crowdsourcing intelligence. If you think about how that might apply to a college syllabus, so the faculty member says for the next class, read all this. But if I with AI, if I could tag what the smart kids are doing, as opposed to what the professor said I should do, I would follow the crowdsourced intelligence of what the smart kids are doing, which may not be what the faculty member has said. Is kind of bringing that together. And yet there is so much more. When I look at our survey data from CIOs about AI kinds of issues, a couple of things emerge. One, the early implementations are going to be those that are baked in. There's a thing about AI implementation as opposed to operational, ERP, organizational kinds of issues. It's the ones that get baked in by third parties that will be the ones that will be easiest and most widely deployed because they don't require individual involvement. That doesn't necessarily require an individual to sign off or do any custom design work on some of these issues. And potentially there's an immediate, at least in the presentation, if it's done right, there's an immediate added value if it's done well and it's done right. But again, with any kind of technology, there's a learning curve for this. And so, as I think about where that applies to analytics, where it applies to some other kinds of institutional resources and services, these things are going to take time. we're going to have to get past what this kind of, what I would characterize, at least others may take issue with that, is kind of a tier one response to the chat box pops up and says, how can I help you with tutoring, or how can I help you navigate the campus website or financial aid, or some of these other kinds of issues for additional added value resources and services to other constituencies and other stakeholders.
It's interesting, you've mentioned two stellar examples of the use of AI, to your point, or one, at least Amazon, to your point, that the chatbot is what we're most familiar with. How can we help you? But I think what is really lost on a lot of folks is how much of AI and machine learning is going on behind the scenes at Amazon and also Netflix. Those are considered category killers in their worlds, because they're using AI to make predictions about what you are most likely to want to acquire. And I think people are really familiar with that in the Netflix world, because of all the suggestions that they're making for the TV programs you should watch and the movies that you should watch based upon your viewing habits across the months or weeks, or even in the current environment, the days that you're doing streaming. It strikes me, at least, that there are probably category killers like Amazon and Netflix that might be coming for higher education. But to your point, there's still a ton of education that's needed to get beyond these kind of tier one applications.
Yeah, well, if we use the Netflix or Amazon analogy for a moment, there are applications out there, for example, that do that with course selection for students in terms of major and essentially degree completion and other kinds of issues. And to me, that's a high level tier one, but it's a tier one. It's kind of a mapping. It's kind of taking, again, this experience of you and other majors in terms of where you are and what you'd like to do. But that doesn't require training on the part of the end user. It's just that's delivered to you. And as we think about sort of what may be the higher order opportunities in terms of faculty looking at what's going on in their classes, deans and administrators looking at what's going on in departments and across the academic enterprise, there may be more training and user engagement other than the kind of, we're going to just present this to you as a fait accompli. And that's going to take more work on the part of both users and providers.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah. So now we're really going to change gears. You served as the director of the Digital Fellows Program for a fellowship program for 30 provosts, I think is what it was, that was supported
by the Gates Foundation.
Yeah, the Gates Foundation. And you got to know that group pretty well. What are some observations or advice you would give to C-level administrators in higher ed?
So
I guess
the background about that. This was a very different initiative for the Gates Foundation. Up until this program, a lot of their stuff was sort of on the ground. This was really targeted as a leadership development program. It was a national competition for 30 provosts. And unlike other kinds of traditional fellowships, which is about my portfolio, this was about helping provosts develop a portfolio to help their institutions. Some had some experience in digital learning, some did not. But it was an attempt to say we're going to create the professional development opportunities, and we're also going to provide a little seed money in terms of what you might do at your institutions to provide additional leadership and additional support. This program was incredibly successful. The $1 million grant generated another $8 million in campus commitments for various kinds of digital initiatives across the campuses that were involved in this program. I think for many of the provosts, some were surprised when they actually had to go pull back and see what was the inventory and activity at their campuses. For others, it opened up issues about how do we deal with recognition and reward for faculty members. And for many, it affirmed a new level of commitment in terms of their interest and their understanding about instructional infrastructure, user support, strategic planning on the instructional side, in terms of looking at that tech-enabled high touch part of it. I think as the summary article of kind of a year in, the CAO role, kind of the learning outcomes for many faculty members. This is not easy. This is not bolting on technology. There's a lot of planning. You have to have faculty engagement, instructional support. To me, one of the most successful examples we saw at some institutions was that for some of them created their own version of a digital fellows program. In terms of, we're going to give you a small grant to do something in your courses. And rather than just saying, okay, you are a digital fellow, we're waving a wand at Acme College, they did ceremonies, they did campus announcements to elevate those folks. But at the same time, they did a public marriage ceremony, in the sense that, by the way, this is Susan Jones or Robert Smith from the Campus Technology Center. This is your new BFF. This person's going to work with you. So it's not a matter of the mad scramble in the closing weeks to say, oh, I got to get this done. This is somebody you're going to work with and introduce to a resource to sort of front end that planning process and highlight it in a public way, and a commitment to assessment on these things. And there was also a commitment, I think, that was one of the striking things as well, to kind of, which is very hard for campuses and very hard for CAOs and faculty. What did we do well and what do we need to do better? In terms of changing the data culture in higher ed for too long has been, what have you done wrong and how can we beat you over the head with this thing? As opposed to, let's change that data culture of using data as a resource, not as a weapon. What do we learn from this and how do we go forward? We're not here to penalize you. We're here to say, okay, we're going to understand. We're not going to do this 100% well. We want to underplay the tendency to overpromise. We don't want you to cook the numbers. We want you to be candid about the numbers. And how do we do this on an iterative basis, both at the individual campuses and the group, to collectively learn from these experiences, share from these experiences, and go forward using data as a resource, not as a weapon.
Yeah, great point. And I would think that there was eye-opening here that digital transformation is not just solely the responsibility of the CIO, but also created a much tighter relationship between these CAOs and the CIOs with which they worked.
No question. I mean, part of the piece that's on the left side of the screen, Provost as digital leaders, if you look at this process over essentially 5 decades, 40 years at the arrival of Macs and PCs, if your hair is gray or thinning, you've been around through this process. Originally, these were viewed as a technology problem. What do we do with these Macs and PCs? And so these became, often the leadership on this, and I say this a little bit flippantly, but respectfully, became the heavy metal guys. The people that emerged in these leadership positions were the vice presidents for computing. It'd be a pre-CIO term. And it was, how do we deal with these things? These were heavy metal guys. They were engineers and came out of engineering and computer information departments. The second wave of leadership, I think, were academics who were perhaps not in science and technology fields, but saw the power and potential and got drawn in as a second wave of leadership. And the third wave, to me, that's emerged over the last several years is a group of CIOs to whom, all of a sudden they recognize that if this is going to go forward, this is about the academic infrastructure, not just the IT infrastructure all along. And I mean, to me, again, this is one of the issues as we look at what's going on in the wake of COVID. In the wake of Katrina, in the wake of Sandy and other kinds of disasters that have hit regions and individual campuses, a lot of the disaster planning or response was about IT security, was about operational issues, and the instructional disaster issues were effectively dealt with like a snow day. Short-term interruptions from which we can easily recover. COVID is not a snow day. This is not 3 or 4 days of interruption. This is large, this is significant, this is undetermined in terms of how we go forward. And again, this rush to screen and stream has huge consequences for individual faculty members, for institutions, for students in terms of how we do this now and how we go forward. And the absence of instructional plans for these issues and how that will change the larger conversation about instructional planning and the definition and the resources allocated to instructional infrastructure.
Yeah, I would hazard a guess, Casey, that the 30 provosts who went through this program are way better prepared than the majority of provosts for the wake of COVID-19.
I'm hoping so. It's a good question. I'll poll them.
Yeah. Well, speaking of COVID-19, you must have some further thoughts and recommendations. We referenced this earlier. Everything has changed. This is seismic, right? Staff have remote working arrangements, online learning, or remote learning actually is the better phrase for it. Admissions deadlines being changed from May 1st to June 1st. On-campus and off-campus events, the budgeting process being completely blown up by this, including public funding, students' ability to pay, endowment and fundraising performance. You must have some thoughts and recommendations about technology, its risks and rewards, particularly in the environment of C19.
Well,
Some thoughts about that?
yeah, so I think as hard as it's going to be, the first thing we do is take a deep breath, but not a long one. And we have to walk. We cannot avoid this, obviously. Most campuses aren't. But when I think about some of the press releases I saw that was sort of suggested with the wave of the digital wand will solve this problem, remote learning is not online learning. This is kind of bolted on at best with flour paste glue for some folks. Some campuses had 2 days, others had 2 weeks. I think of Jim Pazinski, who's the vice president for digital learning for the University of North Carolina system. When I talked with Jim in the early days of this, after the North Carolina system announcement, he was talking about 15,000 faculty members and 54,000 courses over 2 weeks. And that was the classroom-based courses, let alone anything else that was already going on online. How do you do that? How do you provide support for that? How do you do training and infrastructure for that? I think that some advocates and evangelists will say, this is a crisis, this is a terrible thing to waste. For some faculty members, it will be the catalyst to say, okay, I've got to confront and master some of these tools that I've avoided for a period of time. But that doesn't solve the larger problem. We're going to have to deal with issues about how do we deal with what we have to call the lost term, in terms of what's going on, the conversations about pass fail that are going on in both K-12 and higher ed in terms of the term ahead. How do we deal with that instructional experience and doing those assessments? How do we do planning for the fall? Because not only has the instructional infrastructure been overwhelmed just trying to play catch up now, but for the faculty members who are planning courses, and how do they retool those courses based on both this experience and the unknown of what we have to do for fall 2020 in both in large courses and small and student populations. What's opening going to look like? What's orientation going to look like? Let alone obviously graduation across the board largely has been canceled. How are campuses going to deal with the finances on this? There's one part of that for the room and board operations. Are they going to give back on tuition? We don't know, and there's just the question about where and how we know, and who's affected. This will be the conversation we were having before March 1st about some campuses at risk about closing. That's going to be accelerated. We're seeing the announcement about campus closings already. What about part-time faculty at greater risk? These are the gig employees in higher ed, gig economy employees, who are being asked to do even more work than they normally do for a pittance, to sort of carry on their courses. I have no great wisdom. I can raise the questions. I don't have answers. The one thing I would say is, as campus leaders go forward, the tendency is going to be to cut. Don't do it. Don't whack the infrastructure. If anything, figure out how to invest more in the infrastructure, because that instructional infrastructure is going to be essential. Now,
well, actually, it's interesting, because one of the things I was thinking about while you were talking was whether or not there might be a greater tendency to look these days at the ROI for technology investments. I mean, ROI, I don't have to tell you, it's a dirty word in the context of most higher ed institutions. And to your last point about don't whack the infrastructure, do you think ROI becomes a more important part of the conversation?
It does, but the fact is, this is like testing for the virus. It's too late in many ways. We have done a terrible job of assessing our ROI. Our survey data says that maybe a fifth of campuses do any kind of evaluation of their IT initiatives, whether they're classroom innovations or other kinds of things. So all of a sudden say, wait a minute, we have to stop and do an ROI. We don't have a choice. Essentially, we have to use that bad metaphor. We're building the plane while we fly it. We're going to have to bake some of these in now as we go forward. But the fact is, we are going to be even more dependent upon some of these technologies. We're going to have to make thoughtful choices. And again, the tendency I fear at many campuses is say we're going to cut back. And my one statement is don't. Now more than ever, you have to invest in the infrastructure. Instructional support for faculty, user support for faculty, students, user support for students, and other kinds of resources to the extent that campuses can provide them, whether it's Wi-Fi for off-campus populations who have dispersed, other kinds of instructional support, Chromebooks for students who don't have adequate platforms. all this is part of the challenges that we confront individually and collectively.
Well, great, Casey. Appreciate those comments. And for those of you watching and listening during the interview today, we referenced several blog articles and reports that may be of interest. Be sure to check out these links that you see on the screen here. You can also find the links to these blog articles and reports on the Othot website in the resources section. And you would surf to othot.com to actually to find those. Thanks, Casey, for not only joining us today, but for being our first guest on the Higher Ed Talks. I enjoyed the conversation immensely, appreciate it. And as I mentioned previously, if you'd like to check out Casey's blog articles or learn about Othot, visit the website at othot.com. If you have any topics or suggestions for speakers, please let us know, and you can contact us at othotteam@othot.com. And Casey, again, very, very appreciative, and you know, you've been gracious with your time today. And I don't know if you've got any closing thanks or comments you'd like to make to our listeners.
Just wish everybody well through this, both personally as well as professionally. This is a huge challenge, the likes of which we've not seen. You know, I've lived in higher ed for 40 years. You know, each crisis along the way, people say, is this the big one that's going to actually be it?
Yep. And I'll echo that. In the current environment, please remember, everybody, to stay physically distanced. Remember all whom you stay home for. Those are the healthcare workers, the service industry staff, your family, your friends, your colleagues. Stay safe and healthy, everybody. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you again. Stay safe.